Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight, and welcome to all of our people on Zoom. And we're excited that you're all here. We are waiting for Fred Johnson to join us. He is on his way, but I hear the traffic is a little nasty down that way, and so he'll be down up here in just a few minutes. But if it's all right with you, I would like to start. And we'll begin our program as we begin all programs at the Silver Sides with the Pledge of Allegiance. Am I loud enough for everyone to hear, or do you wish to grab the mic? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. It's been a very exciting lecture series. I have been enjoying it, all except for the evening when I had to give a presentation. I love talking about the flyer, but it's been 2 years or so since I gave a little over a year since I gave my last presentation. But it's so much fun to be able to talk about the wonderful stories of the men and women of the United States military and all their incredible contributions that they have made to our country. Thank you, each and every one of you, for coming out tonight. And for all of you at home, we're very happy to have you out there in Cyberland listening in on us. And please, at the end, feel free to unmute your mics and ask any questions that you would like to, and we'll be very happy to answer them. So, as all of you know, the USS Silverside Submarine Museum does not receive any state, federal, or local funding. Everything we do here at the museum comes from the kind, generous donations of our community, as well as the admissions to the museum and the gift shop sales. So I thank each and every one of you for coming out. Those of you that are members, we truly appreciate that. It is also through the wonderful kindness of several of our sponsors that our lectures are possible. Our sponsor for this series, our overriding sponsor, is the Birch Foundation out of Holland, Michigan. And those of you that are here with us routinely, they're a wonderful, wonderful foundation that believes that education is key to service, and service, whether it be at the state, federal, or local level, is key to community building. And it is their proud honor, they tell me, to be able to support this institution through our lecture series and serving our mission of education. And one of the things we talk about a lot here is that how do you honor something if you know nothing about it? And so therefore then, whether the person that served in the Revolutionary War, served in the War of 1812, served in modern times, served in World War II, or will serve in the Space Force of the future, they deserve our respect, because we never know what the United States is going to ask of our men and women of the military, and they always do their utmost in order to defend ourselves and our country. And so I thank each and every one of them for doing that. Our media sponsor is Blue Lake Public Radio, and they are another great group that's local to the area, and they do a great job at keeping everyone informed. And so we're very happy to have them as our sponsor as well. Tonight's program will be by Fred Johnson. It'll be about Doolittle and the very first air raid that was hit against the Japanese in 1942. And then also talking about the USS Hornet, because the two could not have worked out better together. Each of the groups we'll talk about hit a very definitive end towards the end there, and their stories are so unique and troublesome, but wonderful. The honor that they did is just incredible. Now, I have some signs if any of you are interested in them. They're put out by the Office of Veterans Affairs from the state of Michigan. This is a website that people can go to see where, if you needed veteran services, that you can go to. If anyone is interested in any of this, they're yard signs or window signs, whatever you would like. There are several of them in the gift store if anyone has a front yard. That gets people to travel by so that people can know if they're not receiving the services that they feel that they need, or there are services out there that they're entitled to that they know nothing about, then please have them go to this website. It's just kind of a way of letting people know that the services are there, and they're there for everyone that needs them, and for anyone that is entitled to them, they should be using them. The lecture series that we have this year is very close to our heart here at the Silversides because our own submarine served in the Pacific during World War II. And so many of the stories that we hear are very close to us because even though you may have been a submariner, you also served on different vessels. You also interacted with different people from different branches of the military. And so many of the maneuvers and the battles of World War II in the Pacific had many different contingencies on them. As we'll hear tonight, we have the beginnings of an air force, but we have the vessel. They had to take some time and figure out how to make that vessel capable of carrying an airplane. But then, what about all the vessels that were used to transport the men into battle, to carry the supplies, to take the wounded away, to be able to help bombard the beaches before the invasions? So all of those groups are very closely tied together. So when we talk about the Pacific, you talk more about multiple branches than you do when you talk more about the European theater of war. When we talk about the European theater of war, we talk a lot about the airplanes, but they didn't have their own service at that point. We talk a lot about the Army. We talk a lot about the Marines, but we don't spend a lot of time talking about what the Navy was doing in the Atlantic and in all. They were very involved as well. But there was a lot more intercommunications. One topic that I really wanted to include in this, but you know, you only have 10 lectures, you can't include them all, is the rivalry between a certain Mr. Nimitz and a certain Mr. MacArthur. They may have butted heads a few times during the conflicts as to who was going to be in total charge. Now, if you look at both of them, they both made perfect sense to everything that they were doing. And they both knew that what it was that they needed to meet their objective. And it was hard for them to work together. And just like any person that, you know, you need to be single-minded and determined to get what you need done. And so it was very hard for Nimitz and MacArthur, and oftentimes they had to have someone else intervene on their behalves in order to settle the conflicts. When you think about all the times that the coordination that went into it, it's just an astounding amount of time. And the one thing that we seldom ever talk about is logistics. And at some point we would like to do an entire exhibit on the logistics that's required to do everything for the, to get everyone into place. Now, I think about it scheduling a staff of 13, making sure that I have people in each of the different spots that need to be here. And that's just a few people. Can you imagine moving entire battalions? Can you imagine making sure that they have the food, the water, the medical supplies, the ammunition, knowing what the battlefield is going to be like, knowing everything that they needed to have pre-going into that, and then have someone 6 months beforehand thinking about building everything that they needed and shipping it over to them. It's an incredible thing that happens when you think about how many people were back here in America at that point, building the vessels that were going over, putting together the ammunition, filling the ships, and putting them in the proper order in which to be unloaded so that the items that would be needed first would be unloaded first, and the items that would be needed later on would be unloaded later on. And just think about one of the stories that we talk a lot about the submarine service is that they got the best food in the military. And they got the best food in the military because they had such a high death rate, and it was an enticement. Young men, they like to eat. Young men, they continue to, you know, grow when they're 19, 20 years old. They're expending a lot of things. So food. So on the Silversides, there was actually a freezer for all the frozen food and all the canned items. But think about this. Here you are going out. You have to sit there and think about, we'll be on a war patrol for 6 to 8 weeks. I have 72 men. And it's one of those math problems we ask the students when they come for all the time. How much do you need to take with you in order for you to be able to survive? How much fresh water are you going to have in that ballast tank? How much are you going to ration to people? How often are you going to be able to take that shower? How often is the cook going to be able to continue cooking fresh food, or when will you have to move over to the canned stuff and the packaged stuff and the dry things? And that's an amazing set of logistics, and I don't think we ever give enough background information to them on the whole concept of logistics. And then you think about the planning that goes into it for each of these battles. And it's the war colleges and the military make plans for things that we would never assume could ever possibly happen. And it's an entire stool of study, of thinking about everything that is out there that could potentially happen. And I think about that as they're doing those things now. What if, what if, what if? And coming together and having these plans in anticipation of those things. And as we're thinking about Doolittle's raid, the things that he had to think about before he left. How to make it so that a plane could take off in such a manner when aircraft carriers were just being started. How to bring enough fuel. What were their ditch points going to be? What was their ability to happen, because they knew they were going to have to probably crash land those planes. There was going to be less than a likelihood of them being able to make it back. So you think about all the planning that goes into those things. It's just utterly amazing that people think that far in advance. I mean, I think about this place and I have 5-year, 10-year plans, but this is just one museum, one small staff. Can you imagine trying to do it for an entire military at a time? And just the simple things, like in our own community. Those of you that are familiar with going downtown, the Amazon building actually made, during World War II, underwear for servicemen. And it was shipped out right out of our own community. Something so utterly important. You think about all the people that are in the military and all the rotten places there in the jungle, getting wet, falling into water, getting their things dirtied, and all the other things. And here's a small little town in the middle of nowhere in the Midwest that's providing them with their clean undergarments and fresh undergarments. You know, you think about that versus the treads of a tank, or the motors that go into something. What's more personal? Going down, you know, you think about those things. And then when you look at Brunswick, you changing from making bowling balls and bowling alleys to making the walking decks of airplanes during World War II. And Continental Motors, and Forge, and CWC Cannon, making the crankshaft that actually is on the silver sides, right here in Muskegon. Isn't that kind of a full, you know, the silver sides was not made in Muskegon. She was made in Mirror Isle, California. Think of how many things had to be shipped back and forth between there in order to get all those pieces in one place for that. And when you look at all the food stuff that were produced here in our own community to be packaged up and sent out, it's just utterly amazing. It boggles the mind that there are people that are able to plan that far in advance and to think of every single need that a group would have. And Muskegon was really a hopping place during that point. They were looking for people to come up here because there were so many jobs, so many foundries, so many things that needed to be part of the war industry, and they just did not have enough people. And it changed our entire community. And so I look back at all those people and think, wow, someone really did a lot of planning. And it just, to me, boggles the mind as to how much they're doing. And so hats off to all those people, everyone from Muskegon, all the way down to everyone from the South Pacific, to everyone that was serving in Europe, because it's a feat that was amazing, and it all came together, and it served the purpose that it needed to keep the world safe from democracy and continue on. And so that's one of the reasons we do what we do, because even though someone might not be a veteran, they certainly gave their all helping out the community here to make sure that we were able to promote and to do as much as we can. So without much further ado, I will turn this over to Fred. Thank you all for coming out. If you have any questions at the end, I'm more than happy to answer any of them, or Fred can answer them. I know nothing. So thank you all. Sure.
Good evening, everybody.
Hi.
Good to be with you all again. U.S. Riverside Submarine Museum Winter 2022, carrying on with our series on the Pacific War. Today, I'll talk to you all about raiders. This is the Doolittle raid, but I'm going to do this from a different kind of context. Now, I thought about starting out with just the Doolittle raid. I'm going to talk about the Doolittle raid for sure. But
Fred, can you speak up a little or give me a
yes.
mic? Okay.
The Doolittle raid, definitely. But the Doolittle raid occurs within the context of a larger story about naval aviation. So let me take it from there. This B-25 taking off of the USS Hornet is an iconic photo of this plane taking off on the deck of that aircraft, on the deck of that ship, April 18, 1942, just a few short months after the Japanese had hit Pearl Harbor, sinking a good number of battleships and killing 2,400 Americans. But long before Jimmy Doolittle and his raiders took off the deck of the USS Hornet, long before then, there were some other things happening that would make the Doolittle raid possible. Think of it like this: a twin-engine medium bomber taking off of the deck of a ship called an aircraft carrier. You realize that once upon a time, the idea of taking a plane taking off of a ship was radical. Somebody had to make that happen. Somebody had to ask the question, can that be done? Can planes land on a ship? And if they land, can they take off? The answer was yes and yes. We know that today. In 1911, they didn't know that. This is Eugene Burton Ely. Eugene Ely was a mechanic. I think he was a mechanic, a car mechanic, also a bicycle mechanic. You know that the Wright brothers were also bicycle mechanics? Something about these guys who flew airplanes, they started off flying, either started with bikes at first. Eugene Ely wearing those old-looking football helmets. This is what was called the I'm going back. Another one. Another one. Another one. This one. This is the Curtiss pusher plane. Okay. Think about it like this, fellow inhabitants of the 21st century. You think you have faith? You know what faith is? Faith is sitting in that and going to fly. That's called faith. Listen, the concept of a right pusher plane works because the way the airplane takes off then and now, the principles aerodynamically are no different. A plane has to gather enough, has to either be pushed forward fast enough or be pulled forward fast enough. And in the case of an airplane with a propeller on the front, it's being pulled forward. Either way, pushed or pulled, it's got to build up enough, what they call an envelope of lift, so that you notice that the wings is shaped like a. Wilbur and Overwright looked at a bird's wing. They're trying to figure out how do birds stay aloft all this time. They looked at birds that were just soaring all the time, eagles, crows, all kind of birds, and they noticed that the wings on a bird is a certain kind of way that the pocket of air, the lift, was there constantly. So the propeller there would drive the plane forward enough so that it will build up enough of a pocket of air, and at some point it will lift on its own, and to stay aloft, you have to make sure that pocket of air stays there, of course, because if that doesn't happen, there's a thing called crashing that occurs. Now here's Eugene Ely, looking like he's wearing this, again, that leather helmet, and the steering wheel mechanism right here. These aircraft were very, very simple, made out of cloth. The mechanics on these things are very, very rudimentary compared to today. The whole point of a jet engine is that a jet pushes an airplane forward at super, super high speeds to make sure that the lift up under the wing is maintained and stays constant. This is Eugene Ely standing there with his wife. On November 14th, 1910, Eugene Ely, working with the U.S. Navy. Now, understand, this is the early days of aviation. So they don't know nearly what we know, what we take for granted right now. Then what? You call Southwest Airlines, you go to the airport, you get on the plane, you get on, you don't think about it. You know, if you're riding Southwest, they'll give you a pack of peanuts maybe. But
Fred, I'm going to screen share, so I'm going to take this down for just 1 second.
sure. All the things we take for granted about flight and travel today, they simply don't know. And here's the part that I don't know about you, but this is the part that always just makes my jaw drop. When I think that in 1910, so many questions that we don't even ask anymore. From 1910, if you were born in 1910, when this event occurs, if you're born on that day in 1910, 59 years later, Neil Armstrong is walking on the moon. Now, my students at Hope College, they don't believe me when I told them that 59 is young. They don't believe that. But I told them, live long enough and you'll be that young too. But that is a really short time. Go back one. So there he is, Eugene Ely is in that right pusher airplane. There's a light cruiser called the USS Birmingham. He and the Navy had gotten together, and what I meant was this. Ely, the Navy, and Curtiss Airplane Company, all these different airplane companies, Boeing, Curtiss, all these planes that'll be built by people with companies that we just take for granted today, they're still in the early stages of being founded and competing with each other. And they're all asking this question about, can an airplane land on a ship? But before they land on a ship, the first thing that Eugene Ely wants to explore is, can an airplane take off of a ship? Well, that thing about lift is questionable because you need the ship to be rolling forward in order for that lift to build up across the deck. You say full speed ahead. If the ship is going forward in the water, then the wind is blowing across the deck. If the propeller is going to push it forward, that is more acceleration, more lift. It's a good chance that it will take off. Now, there was a wooden platform erected on the bow, approximately 80 feet long. Ely made his first takeoff from the ship, barely. The plane rolled off the edge of the platform and settled briefly, skipped off the water. The propeller was damaged, but Ely stayed airborne. Now he landed 2.5 miles away. Now this looks like, that's a lot of verbiage, of course. This makes a lot more of a powerful statement looking at the photo.
Nice.
This is what I mean about faith. Faith. Eugene Ely takes off. And I'm thinking at this point, he must have been saying to himself, oops,
Yeah.
this was a bad idea. But he did land. So he goes on to have another test on January 18th, 1911. Just because I had to ask the question. So on January 11th, 1918, Eugene Ely makes history on the USS Pennsylvania. They built another wooden deck, and this time, you notice how this deck drops down? It's in San Francisco. It is moored. It's not out. So it's tied to the dock. It's not going to go anywhere. So he lands on board the ship. That's him making the final approach. Another angle. Closer. And he finally touches down. Ely laying down the deck of the USS Pennsylvania. Big success. The sailors run to him. Congratulations. His wife is on the ship. The captain's proud of him. Eugene Ely is the man of the day. The man of the hour. Like I said, his wife is there with him. Captain Pound's right here. Eugene Ely has made it successfully. These things right here around him, these are bicycle inner tubes.
Oh.
In case he fell into the water.
That can overcome it.
Right? Again, I am a Christian. I've never had that much faith. Eugene Ely was a man who believed in what he was doing. His wife obviously was proud of him.
Yeah.
He prepared Now he's proven that you can land on board an aircraft carrier or a ship with a deck. Now the question is, can you take off of the ship with the deck that you've landed on? So he did. And again, I can't help but think that at this point Eugene Ely is saying to himself, oh, come on. Is at this point Eugene Ely is saying to himself, I got a bad feeling about this. But you know what? He makes the flight successfully. And from different accounts that I've read, there were different observers from different navies or different delegations around the world who were watching this particular day, because he proved this. You know that oftentimes it's not at all unusual in the history of the United States, where other countries have sent military attaches around the world to see other militaries operating. We get ideas from them, they get ideas from us. And so on this particular day, there were foreign dignitaries watching this, taking notes. There's another angle of it. Eugene Ely proves that a plane can take off of a ship. But here's the only big thing about this. When he does that, that January 18th, 1911, is the birth of naval aviation. It's the birth of naval aviation, the air arm of the United States Navy. Now, you would think that somebody would see the immediate value of an aircraft carrier, a ship that can carry airplanes. Think about its brand new technology. And the ship of the day, the capital ship of the day, the ship that declared you being a superpower, a great power, was not a ship that can carry airplanes. Again, airplanes are brand new, they're rickety, they're light, they don't look very sturdy, and they are rickety, they're light, and they're not very sturdy. They can't carry any bombs at all. In fact, during World War I, when the Germans started bombing London, they're not going to do it in airplanes. They're not going to do it in airplanes alone. They're going to do it in the big Zeppelins, the big balloons. And the Zeppelins are big, they're loud, they're low, they're slow. They fly over London, they get over Target, and then in the cupola down below it, some guy holding a bomb, literally holding a bomb, pulls it outside, it says, bombs away. And then the Zeppelin, then the guy driving the Zeppelin says, all right, come on now, let's get out of here. So you have like a 2-hour bomb run, people shoot at it, it's full of gas, it's inefficient, no one takes airplanes seriously. The entire world had built its power around battleships, big weapons. It's 1911. Just 4 years earlier, President Theodore Roosevelt has sent around the world something called the Great White Fleet, a series of battleships that let the world know the United States has arrived on the world stage as a power. Not to overtake Great Britain, but just to let the world know, we have arrived, we're here. And that, it took them 2 years, 1907 to 1909, for that battleship fleet to go around the world. So capital ships, if you wanted to be a great power, you had to have battleships. Aircraft carriers were not on people's mind. As far as what Eugene Ely did, it was a nice experiment, interesting, but it'll never take out a battleship. Okay? You can think that way. It's 1911. Enter Billy Mitchell. If you know the Milwaukee area, Mitchell Field is named after this guy. It's named after this guy. Billy Mitchell is known as the father of naval military aviation. He had won the Distinguished Service Cross for Valor in World War I, the Legion of Honor in France. He was a vocal advocate. I mean, he was a passionate advocate of air power. From July 28th through 21st, 1921, he proved air power against naval power. There's another element of the story that I have to tell you about. The Navy and the Army, because of their Air Force, there's not even the United States Air Force, Army Air Forces, no USAAF. The Army and the Navy were always, back in these days, squabbling for dollars, the procurement. The Navy got a lot of dollars because, well, they built battleships. And the Army, because the Army was a small force, the Army didn't need a lot of money, so generally speaking, the War Department favored the Navy when it came to procurement dollars, giving them a lot of money to build big battleships. In 1898, right before the Spanish-American War, there was an American military theorist named Commander Alfred Thayer Mahan that said this. He said a lot of things actually, but this stands out. He said, first of all, war occurs a lot less frequently than it used to. And then when it does, it's a shorter duration. And then even though it's a short duration, we recover from it quickly. In other words, humankind at the end of the 19th century has solved the problem of war. Sure, we have a dust up every now and then, but they're short, they're contained, we clean it up, people keep on living. Okay. He says that in the 1890s, the last major conflict that Europeans had before World War I was the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. It was contained, like he said. It lasted only 6 weeks. So contained war, short in duration, and it lasted just a short time, and Europe did recover from it. But it left some long-standing resentments and wounds that the French was visiting upon the Germans in 1914. With that mindset, with the mindset that war is a thing that's of the past, and that some people with the approach of World War I began to think, you know what? It may be that every now and then we may need a little conflict, a little bit of war to tighten up our biceps and make real men feel like men. We don't want to get too soft in a modern industrializing world. What do we need? Battleships. For America, you want to be a great nation, America? Alfred Thayer Mahan said, if you want to be a great nation, you can't have just a Navy. You got to have a battleship Navy. Here's the phrase that the Navy uses today. You got to have a Navy, a battleship Navy, to do what? To project force abroad. So that the president can send a battleship or a battleship fleet to any place around the world. Just like today. The president says, this aircraft carrier battle group, I need to go to the Mediterranean. If you're in the Middle East or any place else, and you're threatening the United States, and you wake up one morning and see a battleship, an aircraft carrier battle group off the coast, you can correctly conclude you're about to have a bad day. So it projects force abroad to let you know sometimes we're in the area, we're there, just to let you know. We may not even do anything. A battleship Navy was the thing to do. Billy Mitchell said that is an old way of thinking. Airplanes were the way of the future. No one believed him. How could they? Those small little dinky things taking on big giant battle wagons? Are you serious? Billy Mitchell said, let me show you. June 20th through 21, 1921. Just some photos of Colonel Mitchell here. I'm sure pilots must be really relieved to have to wear that stuff these days. But he's the father, he's the father of the United States Air Force, instrumental in elevating the need for air superiority. And by the way, folks, there's a difference between air superiority and air supremacy. Air superiority is when you have a wartime affair, and your airplanes are meeting the airplanes, and you're beating them on a regular basis. Air supremacy is when you're in the sky unchallenged. So there's a difference. He believed that bombers should take the place of battleships, and there should be a separate command for the air service. So Billy Mitchell was not only going in, you understand, these are vested interests in the Congress, vested interests in the Navy. He's talking about Navy brass, saying, yeah, airplanes are more important than we are. He's going even against the Army. So he's going against his own service and definitely the Navy. He's putting his fingers in there in the squabbles with the procurement people between the Army and the Navy. Mitchell said, nothing can stop the attack of aircraft except another aircraft. Translation, battleships can't do it, any aircraft can't do it. The only planes that can take care of other planes are other airplanes. June 21, 1921, Billy Mitchell made history. There was a old World War I battleship called the Ostfriesland that the Navy allowed him to use for some tests. Now, this was not the first World War I battleship that had been used for the test that Billy Mitchell was about to run, but it was this one that made the history for him that day. The Navy said, okay, look, we will allow you to equip some of your planes, these Martin bombers, with some bombs to try and bomb this thing and sink it. You're probably not going to do it. And we will limit you to 1,000-pound bombs. Billy Mitchell said, okay. Now you have to understand, Billy Mitchell was the kind of guy who believed in this phrase, act now, beg forgiveness later. So he acted now. He flew these kind of aircraft, the Martin NBS-1. Another view of it. Nothing like the B-17 or the B-29 or the B-52 or the B-47 that we'll come to know. But on this particular day, this is what Billy Mitchell needs. This is what's going to serve his purpose. Planes flying in formation. They took off. There's Ostfriesland waited to get bombed. And the Navy people were standing on shore, standing on a ship, looking at this demonstration, very sure that it wasn't going to work. Let's watch this thing. We going home or going back to the officers club and get some wine or drink a martini. And then his plane showed up over it. They dropped their bombs. And Billy Mitchell knew enough about aerodynamics and apparently oceanography to know that the concussive force of bombs exploding in the water would be enough to damage the ship. So he didn't even have direct hits, just proximity hits. And he used 2,000-pound bombs, well over the weight limit that he'd been limited to. Now, the Navy, of course, was furious about that, but the battleship sunk. It sank. It sank. Uh-oh. That's different. An airplane, one of the little dinky airplanes, sinks a big bag battleship. Yes, it did. The Navy cried foul, not fair. And they accused Billy Mitchell of cheating. And they were right, he did cheat. But you know what, Pete? You know what he also did? He sank a battleship. And people could not unsee that. He changed naval aviation history. Billy Mitchell said, yeah, I cheated. I played against the rules. I did it my way, but please pay attention. The 1921 test proved that sea craft of all kinds, up to and including the most modern battleships, can be destroyed easily by bombs dropped from aircraft, and further, that the most effective means of destruction are bombs. They demonstrated airplanes beyond a doubt that given sufficient bombing planes and adequate Air Force aircraft constitute a positive defense of our country against hostile invasion. It's 1921, 2 decades before 1941, 2 decades before Pearl Harbor. I think Billy Mitchell qualifies, more than qualifies, as a person that we call visionary. Wouldn't you say? And that warning he gave, the warning he gave was not misplaced, because there were things to worry about. Things coming. Already, Japan was going through some changes in the 1920s to the 1930s. If you're interested in such things, there's a book entitled The Rape of Nanking by a young woman named, a young historian, she's passed away now, but her name is Iris Chang. She talks about how during the 1920s and the 1930s, the Japanese government started practicing this thing called the Code of the Bushido. It was the Samurai Warriors Code, which means the way of the sword. And they were raising children to be these warriors to serve the state. So in Nazi Germany in the 1920s, in 1923, you have Adolf Hitler, who stages his beer hall putsch, trying to overthrow the government in Bavaria. Benito Mussolini marches on Rome in 1921 with his black shirts, the squadristi. And then in the 1920s, the Japanese are already practicing this thing called the Code of the Bushido. For some reason, in those decades before World War II, the world was leaning toward authoritarianism and dictatorships and leaning away from democracies. The situation, SITREP. My veterans will understand this. Situation report, November 1941. The situation with Japan was that the Japanese had been on a series of conquests. Their aircraft included. In November 1941, as far as the Pacific area was concerned, this aircraft, hands down, was the best aircraft in the Pacific region, period. The Japanese A6M0. Look at the smooth lines on this thing. Big engine, canopy all the way around for universal for 180, 360 visibility. Fast, light, maneuverable, armed well enough, and it had a pretty decent range on it. The Japanese also had in their arsenal this right here, something called the Kate torpedo bomber. Before World War II, the Americans gave Japanese aircraft different designations, the Zero, Kate, and then this one, the Val dive bomber. The Val dive bomber was this one right here. You have the Zero, the Val dive bomber. These 3 aircraft will all be present on the morning of December 7th, 1941, the morning of the Pearl Harbor attack. On the other hand, the situation for America. Our aircraft at the start of World War II, November 1941. The best aircraft, the best fighter plane we had was the F-4F Avenger. That will be replaced sometime in 1942, 1943 with the F-6F Hellcat. We also had these venerable aircraft. We made a lot of these things. We sold these to the Chinese. Already by 1941, Claire Chennault in the AVG, the all-volunteer group, you know them as the Flying Tigers, were flying these in China. Chiang Kai-shek had actually come to America and got permission from FDR to buy some of these aircraft to get them back to China, where Claire Chennault and the other American pilots who are resigned and were now flying for the Chinese Air Force, such as it was, and they painted these shark faces on them. They set up a pretty good air-to-air kill record by applying Chennault's tactics, another visionary air officer, against the Japanese in that theater. So we had the P-40, the P-41, the P-40, and the P-40 came in 3 variants. The P-40 Kitty Hawk, Tomahawk, and the Warhawk. We also had something called the Brewster Buffalo. The Brewster Buffalo, if you hear the name Brewster Buffalo and look at it and reach certain conclusions, you're right. In fact, there was one Marine Corps pilot who said, any commander who orders pilots out in the Buffalo should consider the pilot lost before leaving the ground. It is inferior to the planes we are fighting in every way, in every respect. Captain Phil White, United States Marine Corps. And we also had this in our arsenal, in our inventory. Twin-engine medium bomber called the B-25 Mitchell, named after Billy Mitchell. You see where I'm going with this? So Billy Mitchell got himself in trouble. He was eventually court-martialed. He still had a pretty good career. He's eventually court-martialed. But the situation on December 7, 1941 took us to a different level. You all are very well read. You all keep up on the stuff I know. So you already know that before December 7th, the United States had an embargo against Japan. We weren't selling them any oil, any steel, or rubber. Now, the Japanese were completely intent upon having a global empire. They had already invaded Manchuria in 1931 and renamed it Manchukuo. The last few days, we've been hearing some of the stuff in the news about a false flag event. False flag meaning a power, let's call it Russia, creates a situation that they use as an excuse to invade another country. Likewise, in 1931, the Japanese created a false flag event to invade Manchuria. They blew up a railroad, said that the Chinese did it. Then they invaded Manchuria, renamed it Manchukuo, installed their own leader, and it became a puppet government. In 1939, the Germans will create a false flag event along the Polish-German border and attack a radio station and use that as an excuse to attack Poland. And of course, because of an agreement earlier with Joseph Stalin, Stalin will roll in and take the eastern half of Poland, the Nazis will take the western half, and for 6 years, Poland will cease to exist as a geographic reality. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese are on a mission of conquest. They want to establish something in the Pacific called the Greater East Asia, called Prosperity Sphere. Because of colonialism before World War I and even after World War I, between World War I and World War II, the Japanese had developed this phrase called Asia for the Asians. What they meant was Asia for the Japanese. They could have gotten rubber from Liberia and West Africa. But Liberia was run, I kid you not, from Market Street in Akron, Ohio, by Firestone Tire and Rubber. They had and they have a 1 million acre plantation in Liberia where they have rubber trees. Now they could get it from Malaysia, Indonesia, rubber. They can get oil, they can get steel from other places. But this is the thing, if Japan intends to be a major power, and to be a major power for a modern army and air force, you need oil, rubber, and steel. If somebody's not going to sell them to you, and you still intend to get them, that means you have to take them. The only thing standing in their way was the U.S. Pacific Fleet, stationed on the West Coast at the time. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was moved to Pearl Harbor, ironically enough, to keep it safe. This guy right here, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was worried about, there were rumors about an assassination plot against him because the army in Japan was actually running the show. Yamamoto was told to plan an attack on Pearl Harbor. The objective was to remove the Pacific Fleet. So Japan had to kick open the door, and the way will be open for the Japanese Navy and the Imperial Army to run rampant, run amok in the Pacific. So Yamamoto plans the overall strategy. But what about the tactics? The strategy is our long-term goal, like a company. Our 10-year strategic plan, 10 years from now we want to be here, we want to be doing, we don't want to be just serving this market, we want to serve all these markets over here. That's great for the vision. But then comes the question, well, how are you going to do that? Commander Minoru Genda. Yamamoto says, we want to take out the American fleet. He says, and here's how we're going to do it. The guy that actually leads the attack, they're going to do it with 6 aircraft carriers. Go back one. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Hiryu, Soryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. 6 very modern, up-to-date, powerful aircraft carriers are going to be their strike force. The Japanese, in other words, have built their entire attack around attack aircraft carriers. They understand about projecting force abroad using these new ships. On the morning of December 7th, they spun up the propellers on their aircraft carrier decks. See these zeros about to take off here? And then, as the sun came up, they took to the sky. This very iconic photograph right here. It is astonishing to think that at 6:30 that morning, Commander Fuchida, that was the one I was looking for. That one. Another zero taken off. The guy who led the attack was Commander Mitsuo Fuchida. When they got over Battleship Row, the sun had come up, he said, Tora, 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 attack, attack, attack. They'd achieved complete and total surprise. Were it not for the fact that it was the enemy attacking us, it might be something to actually marvel at in a positive way. But as it was, America was being attacked. At 7:40 a.m., the first wave hit Wheeler Air Force Base, Hickam Air Base. Then at 8:40 a.m., hit Kaneohe, Hickam again. And America was at war. Clearly we were at war. Now there are all kinds of stories about why didn't Americans know that something was happening. Didn't people see them coming? Yes, they saw them coming. But you gotta understand something. During World War II, American airplane insignia usually was a red ball in the center with a red and white flag on the side, another red and white flag. So people on the ground looking up and seeing that red ball beneath the wing, they thought it looked kind of odd, but it didn't look that different from the way American aircraft had the insignia. So on a number of cases, people saw the planes coming toward target and never said anything about it. They thought it was an American flight formation. Either way, the country found out soon enough that it was a war. December 8th, 1941, President Roosevelt went to the will of the Congress and asked the nation's representatives for permission to give him the permission to send his children to war. The Congress agreed, and we were at war. 3 days later, on December 11th, Adolf Hitler in Europe, apparently not having enough to do, declared war on the United States. So now you have Adolf Hitler in Europe who's fighting the Russians, whom he had attacked 6 months earlier in June, on June 22nd. Now he's fighting the Americans, and now we have the Pacific War, which is on. The situation in 1942 was fearful, lots of fear, lots of chaos, and of course panic. How could there not be panic after what happened? Think of the early days after 9/11. You know, I was teaching foreign policy that morning. We were attacked at the World Trade Center. I came downstairs to teach my class at about 9 o'clock. My students were sitting there with eyes as big as grapefruits. And I said, what's wrong with y'all? What's wrong with you all? And one of them said, Professor Johnson, I think we're at war. I said, stop playing around. That's not a joke. They said, no, for real. I think we're under attack. We walked across the street to a big TV set, and I sat there with my jaw hanging open because I thought, you know, we are at war. An hour earlier, I, like many Americans, was in a state of peace. An hour later, I found out that people had been waging war on us. Now we knew it too. Likewise, people upset, not knowing what to do. What do we do? What do we do first? What do we do next? So there's panic and, of course, there's rage. Isoroku Yamamoto wrote in his diary, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, of course the Japanese celebrated. They had done a master stroke. They had taken out the American fleet, so they thought. But in his diary he wrote, I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. Boy, truer words never were spoken. Enter courage. What are we going to do about this? Enter dedication. Courage, dedication. Enter patriotism. Enter time to do something. Colonel James H. Doolittle had learned of a plan, oddly enough, produced by a submariner. A submarine guy came up with a plan. He said we can strike back at Japan. How are we going to do it? We had to hit him hard. Fighter planes won't do it. We need to have aircraft that'll carry enough of a payload to make it hurt when we hit them. The mission, of course, was Japan. Not distant islands, but the home island of Honshu. Now, when they started talking about what aircraft to use for the Doolittle raid, 3 aircraft were considered. This one, the Boeing B-23 Dragon. They considered the B-26 Marauder. Now the B-23 Dragon, its wings were too wide to fit on the aircraft carrier. The wingspan was just too big. The B-26 was too difficult to handle. They called this aircraft the Widowmaker. There was a night fighter version of this one called the B-26. I can't think of the nickname for it, but the Black Widow. So the best aircraft they could find for the mission that they were planning was the B-25 Mitchell. Notice, right wingspan, top turret gun. Unlike the B-17, no nose gun. The G model will have the chin turret. Twin engines will go fast enough, big enough to have a long range. Twin vertical stabilizers. Odd looking aircraft, but it will do the job. Here's the concept. January 1942, Joint Army-Navy bombing project. The goals: bomb Japanese industrial centers, inflict material and psychological damage on the Japanese, inflict material and psychological damage, cause confusion and slow production, make the Japanese recall their combat equipment. In other words, make them afraid so that where they deployed in the Pacific, they call back combat units and equipment from wherever they deployed over here back to the home island to clear the way for a possible attack in those areas over there. So make the Japanese recall combat equipment from other theaters for home defense. Improve American relationships with the allies in the Pacific. In other words, if we bomb Japan, then other allies, the British for example, will come closer to us. We can get something cooperative happening here. And then finally, and not least of all, boost morale for the American people. And receive a favorable reaction on the part of the American people, boost that morale. People were pretty much down in the dumps. They needed something to lift their spirits. The challenges were included these. Tests taking off of the USS Hornet and ashore at Norfolk revealed that the B-25 can take off. But landing on the carrier will be extremely difficult. So even a medium bomber, on something as big as an aircraft carrier, the medium bomber was still bigger than the fighter plane. So we can take off. Landing is a problem. What do you do with that? I'm glad you asked. The change of plan was, here's what we're going to do. We'll have the aircraft carrier, put the planes up with the aircraft carrier, and sail as close as we can get, launch. And then launch one aircraft to be a pathfinder, that is, to have incendiary bombs, to drop on Japan, to literally light the way for the rest of them to follow. Then the planes will proceed either to the east coast of China or to Vladivostok in Russia. So one way or the other, planes are going to go to China or to Russia. Billy Mitchell and Admiral William F. Bull Halsey met at a secret meeting in San Francisco. And there, they talked over the details of the plan. They discovered that the Russians were very much reluctant to have any American aircraft landing in their area. What are they going to do about this? The Americans decided that since the Russians were not cooperating, the preferred destination became China. China at the time was ruled by a nationalist Chinese named Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek, just for the sake of discussion, will be the person that will finally be defeated in 1949 when Mao Zedong will kick him and nationalist forces off the mainland onto Formosa. Today we call it Taiwan. So China will be the destination that these pilots are going to be aiming for. Halsey and Mitchell figure out, they decide that they need to get within 600 miles of the home island to make this thing work. If they can get within 600 miles, they have just enough fuel to go across the Pacific to get to China and find their way back to America. They left. And in the process of going there, while at sea, look at these amazing pictures. How they have these B-17s strapped down on the deck. Rather B-25s. It is, these planes are all, there. You can see there's barely enough room for these aircraft on board this straight deck aircraft carrier. I mentioned to you all last week that the United States today has what they call angle deck carriers that allows for launch recovery operations around the clock. But in World War II, you have a straight deck carrier, which means you can either launch or recover, but you can't do both at the same time. That's part of the weakness of what the Japanese confronted at both Pearl Harbor and especially at Midway, June 4 through 6, 1942. These are precious, this is precious cargo, these aircraft, these B-25s. This is Colonel Mitchell, who was putting an American medal on a bomb to be delivered to the Japanese. While at sea, Doolittle and Bull Halsey made an agreement. Halsey said, tell you what I'll do. I'll get you to within 400 miles. I'll get you that close. That way we can guarantee success. So the odds were looking pretty good. Until they were discovered 650 miles out from target. Now, 600 miles, that's 250 miles more than what Halsey promised them, and 50 miles more than what their initial estimate of what they would need to accomplish this anyway. Now what do you do? Now what do you do? Jimmy Doolittle gave the order to launch. Launch this aircraft 650 miles out. The decision was made, and they made it. These pictures tell the story of a rocking, rollicking, unstable deck moving back and forth. Army pilots who are only recently used to landing on a deck of an aircraft carrier. Army pilots who are used to having a full-length runway to gather enough speed to build up enough lift to let the lift off. Now they had to do this. Propellers at full maximum power. Captain gave the order to turn into the wind. Lots of wind blowing across the deck. Propellers went to pull them forward, got everything revved up, and now it's just a question of standing on those brakes, releasing the brake, and watching that plane lurch forward on that rocking deck. These Army pilots. And they took off. Can you believe? This is 1942. 21 years earlier, Eugene Ely was landing on the USS Pennsylvania on that modified kite. The Doolittle raid on Japan, April 18, 1942, saw them taking off with the USS Hornet, flying toward the home island of Honshu. the cities of Yokohama, Tokyo, Yokosuka, Nagoya, and Kobe. This is another view of the flight plan. You see that some aircraft hit the target, hit Kobe, and then move on across the Pacific toward Chuchao. It should come as no surprise to us that a good number of these pilots, a good number of them didn't make it back, although a good number of them did make it back. The unexpected employment of long-range U.S. bombers, please bear with me as I read, took the Japanese by surprise, taking a little over an hour to launch. Doolittle's B-25s carrying high explosive and incendiary bombs flew on and hit targets in Tokyo, Yokosuka, Yokohama, Kobe, and Nagoya against negligible opposition. Negligible opposition, that is small bits of anti-aircraft fire, maybe no fighter aircraft coming up against them. The translation on that is this: the Japanese did not expect them to come. They knew that they were in the area, they suspected it. But the Japanese at this point in the war were very much like the Nazis had been at the very beginning of World War II, the European theater. When Hermann Goering had promised his Führer to build a Festung de Europa over Europe, a fortress over Europe, promising him that no enemy bomb would ever fall on the fatherland. That promise was broken very quickly. Of the 16 B-25s that took off, 15 crashed in occupied China. The Japanese inflicted brutal reprisals against the Chinese populace in Zhejiang province. One B-25 landed intact at Vladivostok, where the Soviets interned it and its crew. What else would the Soviets do? I recommend this book, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, written by Captain Ted Lawson. There's Ted Lawson there with his wife. It was made into a movie with Van Johnson, which is actually pretty good. Not just because I like Van Johnson as an actor. But if you want really the details of what it was like to crash in China, it took Ted Lawson 2 years to get back to America. I think his face needed some surgery, reconstructive surgery. He made it back to his wife. He lived to a nice age. But in the story of not just the heroism of the pilots who flew on the Doolittle raid, but the fear, the anxiety of flying off that aircraft carrier deck, dropping those bombs on Japan, then finally crashing in China, and then most of all, the kindness of the Chinese people who shuttled him from one town to another town to another town, constantly just barely ahead of Japanese troops about to capture them, the brutal punishment suffered by the Chinese civilians to protect these American pilots. And I've been told that even today, despite that we have Xi Jinping running China, that there's still a soft spot somewhere in the Chinese heart for what America did for the Chinese during World War II because of the Flying Tigers and because of what happened with the Doolittle raid here. This is a picture of Chinese officials following Doolittle's bailout. It's Doolittle with members of his crew and Chinese officials following their bailout near Huzhou, I think that's Huzhou, China, with Colonel Doolittle right here. By the end of the month, USS Hornet was back at Pearl Harbor. These are 2 American PT boats. Back at Pearl Harbor. The mission was accomplished. Now the question is asked, did it change the course of World War II? No, it didn't. I mean, it wasn't like the bombing of Schweinfurt and Regensburg in August and October 1943. Okay, it wasn't like the Mariana Turkey shoot of 1943, 1944. It wasn't like the Battle of Kursk or Stalingrad. I mean, the USS Hornet and the bombing of Japan in April 1942 wasn't one of those major events that turned the course of the war. That would come, that's April 1942, May. Now May will be different. In May 1942, for the first time in naval history, for the first time in aviation history, an American fighter planes and Japanese fighter planes will meet in the skies over their respective aircraft carrier battle groups, and they will have a full-on fight, except that the American fleet will be below the horizon for the Japanese, and the Japanese will be below the horizon for the Americans. In other words, the Americans and Japanese on the surface ships never see each other, which never would have been unheard of with a battleship fleet, because for a battleship fleet, you got to be able to see the enemy. This battle is in the skies over the Pacific. So it's called the Battle of Coral Sea in early May 1942 was the first time that a naval battle was fought not on the surface, but in the skies over the battle fleets. Then the following month, June 4 through 6, 1942, 5 of the 6 attack carriers that hit Pearl Harbor will be sunk at a place called Midway. That's what changes the course of the war. On that battle by itself, Americans would have broken the Japanese secret code. And because they've broken that code, and because they have sunk 5 of the 6 attack carriers and heavily damaged the Yamato, one of the biggest battleships in the world, that will change the course of the war. It will change the Japanese initiative from being offensive to defensive. In other words, the Americans will assume the initiative for the rest of the war. Let me be very clear here. The war is not won. The Japanese are still a very formidable enemy. But what it means is that from that point forward, they no longer have the privilege, the opportunity of choosing the time, place, and method of attack. That falls to us. For the rest of the war, they are in a reactive mode, not proactive. That's what was different as a result of Midway. And it just went downhill for them from there. Sometime in 1943, a group of American P-38s would shoot down Yusuruku Yamamoto. There's a book, if you're taking notes, there's a book entitled Get Yamamoto. Not very imaginative, but it does the job. It's called Get Yamamoto, about these P-38 pilots that finally get the guy that planned the Pearl Harbor attack. So no major strategic change as a result of the Doolittle raid. But it lets the Japanese know, it sends a message. Hello, America calling. You paid us a visit? We just want you to know, we know where you live. We'll be back with some really big stuff. We're in the neighborhood, we're coming for you. And like Yamamoto said, that giant that woke up, filled with a terrible resolve, friend, you haven't seen nothing yet. So it did give the Japanese an understanding, if you want to put it kind of like this, a literal wake-up call, and it provided the necessary boost of morale that America needed in a very vulnerable period at a time when the war was still not even 6 months old. And for that, morale, hope, courage, it can be as effective as any bullet fired at the right target in the right way. You know, in the Marine Corps, they used to say on the rifle range, 1 round, 1 kill. But it takes 1 bullet between the eyes to do the job. You don't need to fill somebody's face full of bullets. Likewise, hope, courage, dedication, channel the right way, like the Ukrainians are doing right now, channel the right way can be just as essential in helping the people defend themselves and maybe, with enough time, achieve victory. That's Jimmy Doolittle. That's the USS Hornet. That's the Doolittle raid for you. Thank you very much.
When was the Hornet sunk?
I don't know.
It was very shortly after.
Where were the B-25s loaded onto the carrier?
The Hornet was sunk October the 26th of 42, exactly 1 year after it had been commissioned. And the Doolittle raid was 6 months after it was commissioned.
Well, this is one more reason why I like talking to you guys, because you tell me stuff. My students ask questions like this: what's a Hornet? So thank you. I focus primarily on just the raid itself, but these details help to round it out. I know that I take a look at I've done a lot of reading also on the battle of Pearl Harbor. You know, looking at the story of the USS Franklin and how it survived, not Pearl Harbor, but Midway. It hung on for a long time. So I was thinking about the Franklin, not so much the Hornet. But yeah, like, was that Cliff?
This was Cliff, yes.
Yes. Thanks, Cliff.
Anyone else out there would like to comment or say anything, please feel free.
I have another comment.
Yes.
I'm a sailor off the Hornet.
Mhm.
The CBS 12, not the 8, which is what you've been talking about. And in our reunions, I was having dinner with a fella who was on the flight deck. And he was loading bombs into the B-25s. He was loading bombs into the B-25. And he said that it shook them all up because there was this guy with brown shoes and a t-shirt helping load these bombs into the planes. And it was Doolittle himself. So just a piece of information, Doolittle was on the flight deck loading the bombs just prior to takeoff.
Could you expand upon why the shoes were so important? Because there may have been this little rivalry based on the kind of shoes you were wearing?
Well, brown shoes were officers.
Right.
Do we have any other questions? I'm going to pass this over.
I don't know if you heard my question. Where were the B-25s loaded aboard the carrier?
I do not know. Who knows where the B-25s were loaded onto the carrier? They were loaded on. They were hoisted on.
Yeah.
I'm thinking that they trained it because they trained their touch and goes in Norfolk before actually deploying.
I think Cliff has the answer.
Yeah, they were loaded at Mare Island in San Francisco Bay.
Okay.
That's where the Hornet had come from the Atlantic. She hadn't even been to combat in the Pacific, but she was brand new, and that's why they used the Hornet. They loaded the planes in San Francisco.
And what you said was CBS. What does the CBS designation stand for?
Well, CBS, the hull is actually CV, so CV8.
Okay.
And the CV12 had several designations. It was CV12, then it was CVA, which stood for attack, and then CBS, which is what I was on. I believe that stands for sonar, submarine warfare. It was not an attack.
I know the Navy still uses the CV designations like that for a ship today.
Yes, yeah.
C is for carrier.
C is it? I'm not quite sure that but
I see is a carrier.
That's what I thought. But I could never figure out what the VS was for.
well,
Carrier vessel.
Okay, this guy says CVS is a drugstore. Okay, granted it is. Yes, it is.
I went to Grand Valley.
That's funny. Yes, ma'am.
On the map showing that they were going to land either in China or possibly Russia, but Korea was right there. Why was Korea not an option?
Because
Can you repeat the question?
So the question is, the map showed that they had a choice of either landing in Russia or China. Why was Korea not an option? The Japanese had been in Korea since 1904. And so Japan had dominated the Korean Peninsula, and Korea will not be divided to north and south until like 1946. Korea gets divided in 1946, right at the very end of the war. And it's something, I read an account where Dean Rusk, the future Secretary of State, and I cannot remember the gentleman who was in the Army with him, but literally, they took out a map from National Geographic and found Korea on it, and drew a line across the middle and said, okay, the Russians can have this half, the South Koreans can have that half, the southern half. And that's how Korea was divided. I wish it was more complicated than that, but it's not. But either way, the Japanese have been in Korea since 1904, doing very terrible things. No. So it was not an option. Another thing about the Japanese being in Korea since 1904, let me add this. Not only have they been in Korea since 1904, they've been in Korea as part of something called the 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War, when the Russians and the Japanese fought each other, and Admiral Togo blew the Japanese fleet. Admiral Togo, Japanese admiral, blew the Russian fleet out of the water at the Battle of Tsushima Straits. He did that by implementing a maneuver called the crossing of the T, which is a battlefield maneuver where, if this is the T, if this line right here is a long part of the T, this is the top part, Admiral Togo took the forward and rear turrets on his battleships and turned them all this direction, where you are. Which means that people got a full broadside. The Russians never saw it coming. And it was Japan's announcement to the world that it arrived as a military power, and it was also an opportunity for the United States to announce to the world its arrival as a military power, because President Theodore Roosevelt negotiated the peace between the two powers later on. Now, that meant though that Japan was in Korea from then forward, and during World War II, in Korea, in the Philippines, in China, the Japanese did some terrible, terrible, terrible things to women, comfort women, the whole shop. But they were there. That's why they did not, among other things, consider Korea. Very good question. Yes. Next.
Does anyone out on Zoom have any other questions or comments?
Great job, Fred, once again.
Thanks, Cliff. Cliff, I want you to know how much I appreciate you. All I got today was, I'm not going to be here on Friday for a good spring break, right?
Google says CVS is combined vision system.
Combined vision system?
Combined, CVS aviation abbreviation, CVS, combined vision system, Vision Falcon flight, combined vision system, yeah.
Yeah, I knew it didn't stand for carrier, but I didn't know what it was.
CVS, let it be known that CVS stands for Combined Vision Systems, and it's still a drugstore. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. We look forward to seeing you next week when we talk about China, Burma, and India. Oftentimes not very much talked about because, other than a few movies that were made by the British after war, most people never thought much about it. But it's key, and it's one of my favorite people that Leahy that's there talking about doing this, and I just like that particular theater. I find it very interesting, and so I'm looking very much forward to that. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you to everyone that's on Zoom tonight. Please consider bringing a friend next week or telling someone else about this, because the more we can do to serve our mission, to honor veterans, and to let people know what it is that they've done is the best way for us to honor a veteran. And so the more people you tell, the more people will be there. And if any of you have gone anywhere and not seen one of our posters, or our poster is missing, please take them with you and put them back up, because it is one of our great things to be able to honor our mission. And so thank you all for coming tonight, and we look forward to seeing you again next week.
Thank you.